Welcome. I'm Sebastian Mahfood, and you're listening to WCAT Radio, the on-air wing of En Route Books and Media, bringing you the dulcet sounds of Catholic wisdom.
So, the topic for this week is, did God speak to Socrates, or who was the God of Socrates? I became interested in this subject matter because I'd heard several Christian philosophers, theologians, apologists, and so on. Well, they speculated that it might have been the actual God who spoke to Socrates, and that possibly the altar to the unknown God that Paul speaks of in Acts 17 had been erected by Socrates. And the reasoning behind this is that Socrates refuses to name the God, whether with a capital G or small g, that he worships and serves, and that there's some tradition that Socrates was a stonemason, so he would have possibly erected an altar to this unknown God that he refused to name. So I found this to be kind of an intriguing possibility, and a while back I did some research and wrote an essay on it, and that's the basis of this podcast here. Now, there's a couple of reasons why I think this is intriguing. The first is that in a very loose and general sense, we can think of Socrates as the founder of the discipline of philosophy, or the father of philosophy. Now, that statement isn't actually true, as there were pre-Socratic philosophers, but the cultural mythos that has developed is that Socrates is the father of philosophy. He's the guy who started it all. So, if the actual God did speak to Socrates, that would mean that in a certain sense it was divine action that led Socrates to found philosophy. Now, since God will say things in Scripture like, "Come, let us reason together," and takes an active interest in the lives of every human person, this kind of seems like something he might actually do. Second, this has implications for the problem of religious pluralism, which is something Michael Jones and I talked about last week. If indeed God was speaking to Socrates, then there's good cause to think that he was speaking to non-Israelites in pre-Christian times, because he did it at least once. Hence, there's another reason to argue that no one stands before God without excuse. If a pre-Christian pagan like Socrates was able to come to some knowledge of God, then it becomes extremely difficult to argue that there are people who genuinely don't know that they need God. If Socrates figured all this out without a missionary preaching to him, how much more without excuse are those who actually hear about the gospel of Christ? And the third reason I think this is an interesting line of research is that some of the recent so-called free thought and atheistic movements have been attempting to appropriate Socrates as one of their own. Here, they'll argue, was a type of atheist who defied the religious laws of the day and was persecuted and killed for it. And he did defy the religious laws of the day and was persecuted and killed for it, but simply reading what Socrates actually has to say shows that their attempt to appropriate him is at best nonsense. If Socrates was indeed an atheist, then he was also a habitual liar, for he speaks of the God, gods, and divine things often and at great length. He credits God, who he calls the God, with pushing him into philosophizing. But a Socrates who is a habitual liar stands in sharp contrast to the rational man of integrity that everyone, including the free thought and atheistic movements, want to remember him as. The reason why people are trying to appropriate him is that we all recognize there's something of real value in who Socrates is and what he was, and so we want to identify with that. It's the same reason why a lot of cults try to appropriate Christ and other religious figures. Further, arguments that Socrates was a type of atheist, as there's some evidence he may have rejected the Greek pantheon of gods, only show that everyone is an atheist. So, as Muslims do not believe in the triune God of Christianity, then they too must be a type of atheist for rejecting that God. But of course, it's just ridiculous to call Muslims atheists. They are not atheists. They believe in God, then they call him Allah. And so it's also ridiculous to say this of Socrates. So I'll go through this essay here. I'll trim it down a little bit, make it a little bit more easy listening, because, often listening to people just read their essays is very boring. I hate it when I go to conferences and people do that, so hopefully I'll get away from that here. But anyhow, after researching and writing all this, I'd say I vary a little bit. Some days I'm about 70% convinced that the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob really did speak to Socrates. Some days I'm only 50%, and other days I'm somewhere in between there. So Paul Johnson once said that in terms of his influence, Socrates was the most important of all philosophers. And I think that's pretty much true. There were philosophers before Socrates, but no one outside of academic philosophers really remembers or actually reads them. Thus, the role of Socrates is indicated in the time-honored distinction by historians of all his predecessors being labeled as pre-Socratics. By the same token, Plato, his student, and Aristotle, who was Plato's student, are now called Socratics. So thus, the cultural mythos is that Socrates founded philosophy, and pretty much every school of thought that wants intellectual legitimacy has attempted to claim him. And so, like I mentioned earlier, the contemporary atheistic and free thought movements have attempted to argue Socrates was one of their own. In his book, Battling the Gods, Tim Whitmarsh, I think I actually did pronounce that one right, Tim Whitmarsh, argues that Socrates was a type of atheist and that he espoused humanistic ethics. Richard Janko claimed that Socrates was what we call a free thinker since he refused to submit his reason to the control of an authority in matters of religious faith. And Andreas Kluth actually claimed, quote, Socrates was almost certainly an atheist. Now, if you're not very familiar with Socrates at this point, I'd recommend you pause or stop listening to me and go read the Apology. It was written by Plato, Socrates' student, and it details a lot of the issues I'm going to be talking about here. It's a quick, easy read. You shouldn't have any trouble understanding, even if you're not used to reading philosophy, and it's going to make a lot more sense of a lot of the topics involved here. Now, Socrates' life tragically ended when he was convicted and executed for charges of atheism and corrupting the youth. So, in this respect, Socrates' supposed atheism is really nothing new. But the question is, were these charges true? Now, contrary to Whitmarsh, Janko, and Kluth, it is generally accepted by scholars and philosophers that Socrates was actually innocent of the charge of atheism. But he did seem to have a theology that was radically at odds with his culture. So I'm going to go through the texts of the Apology and Euthyphro here to demonstrate this. What I'm going to do is explore Socrates' theology and argue that not only did Socrates believe in God, but that his God was quite unique and unlike the gods of his fellow Greeks. Now, in order to get at any of Socrates' ideas in philosophy, we have to first work through something that's called the Socratic problem. I mentioned this back in episode 7 where I was talking about reasons to trust the Christmas story, just as a comparison. And loosely speaking, the problem is that Socrates, like Christ, wrote nothing down. But his followers did make him the subject of a very unique literary genre, the Socratic dialogue. Consequently, he's the best known and least known of ancient philosophers. Virtually everything that's known about Socrates' life and philosophy comes from other people who wrote about him, and there's 3 primary sources for this that are generally regarded as pretty good. Plato, who used Socrates in almost all of his dialogues, a guy named Xenophon, who was a contemporary of Socrates, and Plato's student Aristotle, who refers back to Socrates as a prior philosopher that he's building on and using the work of. Now, Aristotle doesn't actually have a lot to say about Socrates. The philosopher Ralph McHenry said, with respect to Aristotle, it must be pointed out that if our knowledge of Socrates was dependent on what Aristotle wrote, we would know extremely little about the man. And while Xenophon and Plato both wrote quite a bit about him, they said very different things. Additionally, there is very little in Xenophon's work that would entitle Socrates to a prominent position in the history of philosophy. So of the remaining 2, Plato's Socrates is the most interesting, as he says the most. Plato uses Socrates in 28 out of 30 of his surviving dialogues. And Plato's Socrates also, quote, seems to provide the best picture, both for its vivid portrait of Socrates' character and for its philosophical depth. However, this is where the problem comes in. It's widely accepted by everyone who studies these things that at some point Plato stops accurately reporting on Socrates' own ideas and teachings and just starts using Socrates as his own mouthpiece. The question here is not if Plato used Socrates for his own purposes. He absolutely did. Rather, it's where in the Platonic dialogues this change occurred and if it occurred gradually or abruptly. Paul Johnson said, quote, exactly when it occurred in the Platonic omnivore, I don't know how to pronounce that word, but exactly when it occurred in the Platonic dialogues and which dialogues can be described as Socratic or mainly Platonic or wholly Platonic has been debated by scholars for generations. End quote that I badly butchered there. Now, if this was a gradual change, then in many dialogues there's actually a hybrid creature of Socrates and Plato that Paul Johnson calls plot soc. Now, for a number of reasons, it's commonly accepted that Plato's early dialogues show the historical Socrates with a bit more accuracy. And first, the reason is that the later dialogues are much more removed from Socrates by time. Plato wrote them further along. And a related point is that Plato would not have had as much time to develop his own philosophy in the early dialogues as opposed to the latter ones. And finally, there's a very noticeable difference in style, themes, and the issues that are explored in the latter dialogues as opposed to the earlier. This is evidenced in part by the different ideas and focus of Socrates in Plato's later dialogues as opposed to the earlier. As Bertrand and Russell said, the earliest of the Platonic dialogues, which are generally supposed to be the most Socratic, are mainly occupied with the search for definitions of ethical terms. The philosopher Ralph McHenry agrees, stating that Aristotle saw Socrates as primarily concerned with definitions and adding, quote, that Aristotle is not simply repeating what we can read in Plato is indicated by his assertion that the theory of forms or ideas was not something maintained by Socrates. Now, if you aren't very familiar with philosophy, you've almost certainly still heard about the idea of Platonic forms. It's a very prominent theory that Plato thought up. And so what McHenry is saying here is that Aristotle says that idea, Platonic forms, that was all Plato and not Socrates. So that gives us a little bit of a criterion as to how we can try and start figuring out which dialogues are more historical Socrates and which ones are Plato just using him. If it's a Socrates espousing the Platonic forms, that's Plato using him. And if it's not, more likely that it's an authentic Socratic teaching. And you can also just kind of see this in the style when you read them. Go read the Apology, which is the earliest Platonic dialogue, and it generally reads like something that could actually have happened. You can get the sense that, well, this could be almost a verbatim transcript of what happened with a few little things here or there. Then go read Phaedo, and it's completely different. That bears all the hallmarks of a story or dialogue constructed completely to make philosophical points. Now, people have speculated as to why and how this happened. You can read some stuff about that. Paul Johnson has a theory, and a few other people do. But that's not really what's important here. What's important here is that in determining what Socrates thought about God, there's kind of a level of uncertainty, as it's not immediately clear and obvious if we are reading Socrates, if we are reading Plato, or if we're reading a combination of the two. So the way I've attempted to get around this problem is that rather than trying to just solve the Socratic problem, as wiser and better men than I have tried and failed at that, I'm only going to be using two of the early Platonic dialogues, the Apology, which is about Socrates' trial, and Euphoro, where he talks to a guy named Euphoro outside a temple about the nature of the gods. Both of these are early dialogues, and so are more likely to give us an accurate portrayal of Socrates, and both show Socrates discussing the god or the gods, and there is actually a connection between the two in the theology they present. So while there is still a level of uncertainty, I think by limiting us to these two dialogues, we're much more likely to get an authentic idea of what Socrates actually thought about God. And now again, if you're not familiar with Euphoro and the Apology, go read them. It's going to make it a whole lot easier for you to follow this, and they're good philosophical works that you should read anyway. I think Peter Kreeft said one time that no human being should be allowed to die without first reading the Apology because he thinks it's that great, and he holds it in a bit of a higher opinion than I do, but still, you should read it anyway. So when we analyze the Apology and Euphoro, we can come to some conclusions, or some points, and the first is that we can say that Socrates was a monotheist. Well, kind of, maybe. This is tricky because Socrates is often vague. It's actually kind of annoying how vague he is at times. The problem here is that while it's true that Socrates professed no allegiance to the Greek pantheon, and he also typically refers to God in the singular, that is, the God, or just God with a capital G in the Apology, he also frequently made references to the gods in plural. Now, even if you allow for some instances of, say, cultural expressions and discounting the later dialogues as inauthentic, that still leaves a Socrates who talks about both gods and God. And what I mean by cultural expressions here is just, for example, there are atheists who will exclaim things like, "Oh my God," and stuff along those lines. Well, it doesn't mean they believe in God. That's a cultural expression that's developed, and they're just repeating that. Now, in the Apology, Socrates proudly and gladly declares that he must obey God, singular, rather than men. Well, in Euphoro, the question he deals with is not, is the God good, but if the gods are good. Now, on the face of it, this is a kind of puzzling and could lead to the conclusion that Socrates was a bit confused about the nature of the divine. Thus, some have taken Socrates to be doing nothing more than speaking in the language of the day, using cultural idioms. As the philosopher Mark L. McFerrin explains, quote, "Advocates of this portrait have sometimes understood Socrates to be a kind of atheist or agnostic, construing his positive reference to divine beings and signs as instances of his infamous alleged irony. He may talk as though he hears a divine voice, but really, this is but a facon de parleur. For by such phrases he is simply referring surreptitiously in the language of the many to the divine inner promptings of his utterly secular, completely human powers of ratiocination. But step back from McFerrin's argument there for a point, and let's consider Socrates' defense against the charge of atheism in the Apology. He neither explicitly denies allegiance to Greek gods like Zeus and Apollo, nor does he express a belief that they do not exist. Rather, he simply talks over and over and over again about what the god would have him do and how he must obey the god. As the great British philosopher Anthony Kenny says, far from being an atheist, his whole life was dedicated to a divine mission, the campaign to expose false wisdom which was prompted by the Delphic oracle. Further, when he's responding to the charge of atheism, Socrates' actual argument is that because he believes in divine things, he must therefore believe in the divine. So if Socrates was an atheist, then he must have flat out lied at his trial. But no one who studies and appreciates Socrates, wherever they're coming from, wants him to be a liar. And further, lying runs deliberately contrary to the ideals that Socrates championed. He valued truth to such an extreme extent that some people have said it was unhealthy and unwise of him to value truth that much. One of the most appealing aspects of the Socrates that we read in the text of the Apology is this extreme and unwavering integrity that he demonstrates. So, why is there this problem, this discrepancy, where he talks about the god in the Apology and he talks about the gods in Euphuro? Well, the Socrates in almost all Platonic dialogues continually shows a pattern of abstaining from judgment unless he has very good reasons to do so. This is a large part of his famous maximum, what I don't know, I don't think I know, or I only know that I know nothing, as it's very loosely said. It's very fair to say that the Socrates found in all sources is extremely cautious in what he declares true and never does so without expressing what he believes to be very good reasons to do so. It's plain in the Apology that Socrates both regards the god as supreme and that he doesn't declare that, say, Zeus, Apollo, and other Greek gods don't exist. So it's entirely possible that Socrates believed in his god, his unknown god that he refused to name, and was allegiant to this god. After all, you don't obey someone that you don't believe in. And that he also believed the Greek pantheon existed, but that they were lesser than, subservient to, or other than the god he was serving. But there's another possibility that I think is a little bit better, and that's that Socrates simply didn't want to unnecessarily offend the notions of his fellow Athenians by just going around and flat out declaring, your gods are false. Again, looking at other dialogues, Socrates was always interested in helping guide people to the truth, but he doesn't seem to demand that they confront it in a kind of gruff and aggressive way. Rather, Plato has Socrates describe at some length his own method of interrogation, a method that he called something like midwifery. That is, he was helping people bring birth to the truth that they had. He was helping lead and guide them to it. Socrates thought he was helping others to see and understand the truth, much as a midwife helps other women give birth. For this reason, I agree with Paul Johnson when he says, Socrates did not wish to put ordinary people off essential truths by a foolish desire to demolish inessential myths. So perhaps in some sense, when Socrates spoke of the gods, he was simply speaking in the language of his time, as he hoped he could, with time, guide people away from these gods to his god. But it doesn't follow from this that Socrates was an atheist. So here's what we can say about this. Inasmuch as anything can be known about Socrates, it can be known that, quote, he had his religious faith. He believed in one God. And he tried to serve and honor this God, and he called this God simply the God. Now, implicit in this is that he either denies the existence of the Greek gods or he views them as relatively unimportant when compared to the God. And it's also probable that he was attempting to not unnecessarily offend his fellow Athenians, so he'd still often speak of the gods. Given Socrates' commitment to not making unsupported judgments, this option, I would argue, is quite highly likely. So, it was very likely that Socrates was a monotheist of a sort there. And the next point is that Socrates' God was the good. Now, the Euphuro dilemma, which comes from Plato's dialogue, Euphuro, and it's often used as an argument actually against the possibility of an all-good God. Socrates gives an argument in response to Euphoro where he asks if what the gods command is good because the gods command it, or do the gods command it because it is good. Now, obviously, neither of these two options is satisfactory, as both diminish the gods. If the gods command makes something good, then what is good is arbitrary, as if the gods had commanded, say, murder and rape, then those would be good instead of evil. Conversely, if the gods command something because it is good, that is, the thing in and of itself is good, then there's a higher authority than the gods, and you certainly don't want that. Well, the Greeks wouldn't have had a problem with that, but the Christian conception of God doesn't work if there's a higher authority than God. Now, Socrates gets at splitting this dilemma by leading Euphoro toward the idea that the gods command what is good because they are good. In doing this, Socrates grounds the good in the nature of the gods themselves. He splits the dilemma and says, no, it's not that there's something more than the gods, it's not that the good is arbitrary, it's that the gods by their nature are good, so they command what is good. And since nothing can violate its own nature, these gods could no more command something that is not good than they could just stop being themselves. Now we see some further evidence of this in the way Socrates speaks about the god at his trial. He begins his mission of looking for someone wiser than himself because of the oracle's proclamation to his friend that no one was wiser than him, and that just didn't make any sense to him. He claims he knew he did not possess wisdom, but he also knew that the god could not or would not lie. A god who is good is also a god who cannot lie. So it became Socrates' mission in life to go about and question his fellow townsmen to see if there was any man wiser than he. It is also telling that Socrates thinks his god cannot make mistakes, and I'll return to that later. We're already seeing that Socrates served a single god who was the good with a capital G and couldn't make mistakes. It's already starting to sound a whole lot less like a Greek god and a whole lot more like something like the Christian conception of God. So Socrates' God is not just good, it is the good. The God is the foundation for all that is good, and this goodness rests in the God's own nature. Now, from all this, we can assert very confidently that Socrates' God was not one of the Greek pantheon of gods. The fact that he asserts his God cannot lie or make mistakes is quite compelling because the Greek pantheon and the gods of other polytheistic religions were usually anything but good and often made mistakes. I heard the author Salman Rushdie talking at a conference one time, and he said he really enjoyed the stories from polytheistic cultures more than monotheistic ones because the stories in polytheistic cultures were so much better because the gods were so human-like in that they have affairs, they murder each other, and all kinds of horrific things like that. And he's right, that's what they do. It's a common trait among most polytheistic religions is that the gods will behave in selfish, petty, and often very vindictive ways. So Socrates' god was certainly not Apollo, Zeus, or one of the other Greek gods. Apollo often killed people for perceived slights and insults, while Zeus was constantly unfaithful to his wife. That's how Apollo came to exist, if I remember my mythology correctly. And all the other Greek gods did some pretty evil and petty things and even made mistakes. And yet, for Socrates, the gods agree perfectly in their goodness, justice, wisdom, and so on, and do not come into conflict. Now, no one who knows Greek mythology can reasonably conclude that any of the Greek gods are incapable of making mistakes or omnibenevolent. And it's highly unlikely that Socrates would have been so ignorant of his own culture as to not know these myths. Further, he says in the Apology that he spent time with the poets, and all Greek poetry was religious in origin. That is, it dealt with the actions of the gods and their relations with men and women, so he would have been in a position to know. Also, in the very text of Euphoro, Socrates says to Euphoro that he doubts most of these stories as he finds it hard to accept things like this being said of the gods. So Socrates' god or gods were very different than the gods of Euphoro and the other Athenians. Now this is a remarkable claim because it was the oracle at Delphi that gave Socrates his divine mission, and that oracle was traditionally associated with the Greek god Apollo. In fact, the philosopher C.D.C. Reeve used this fact as a central point in his argument that Socrates believed it was Apollo that spoke to him. Reeve said, quote, Socrates was already sufficiently religious and devoted to Apollo when he heard the news of the oracle to treat it very seriously. For who but a religious person already devoted to Apollo would puzzle over one of his oracles, set about a time-consuming activity to determine its meaning, and persist in that activity even when it made him both poor and unpopular? Mark McFerrin argues something similar, saying, Socrates characterizes himself as the servant of the god of the oracle at Delphi, and the daemon as the sign of the god that aids him in his mission. That makes it fairly plain that Socrates thinks that the most likely source of the sign is the Dephelic Apollo, that is, the god Apollo. And here a daemon, it's not a demon in the sense that you think of a demon as a Christian. A daemon is more of like a divine messenger that gives you advice, or a spirit that kind of tells you what to do that's divine. Something more comparable to like an angel would be in Christian beliefs. And in the text of the Apology, Socrates claims he has a daemon like this that comes and tells him what to do things, and it tells him to avoid doing things and to go do things. And if I'm recalling correctly, I think he claims it told him to go to that trial where he was convicted and killed. But anyhow, back to why this isn't Apollo. The trouble with these arguments that Reeve and McFerrin give is that they ignore the fact that Apollo doesn't really meet the other attributes that Socrates attributed to his god. Apollo is not only not the good with a capital G, but he isn't very good at all. And while Apollo often will make mistakes in the mythology, Socrates describes his god as being unable to make mistakes or to lie. And further, as I've already mentioned, Socrates says he's suspicious of the Greek myths and the stories about Apollo and the other gods. So even if he did think Apollo spoke to his friend through the oracle, he probably has such a radically different idea of who and what Apollo is that it's no longer appropriate to call Socrates' god Apollo, because it's not the same thing the other Greeks had in mind. Just by analogy, both Christians and Muslims believe that God spoke to Abraham. But the Christian conception and the Islamic conception of who and what God is are so incredibly different that it's inaccurate and inappropriate to describe these two different gods as one and the same. They're remarkably different. Likewise, even if Socrates had Apollo in mind when he was speaking of his god, the Apollo he had in mind was so different from the one his fellow Greeks had in mind that it's no longer accurate to describe them as the same thing. And I think this leads us to another pretty astonishing point here, which is that it's very remarkable that Socrates did not name his god. At his trial, if Socrates had simply said that Apollo spoke to him through the oracle, that would have effectively countered two of the charges against him. His fellow Athenians could have no longer claimed that he was introducing new gods or that he was an atheist, because he would have espoused belief in an allegiance to Apollo, and Apollo was their god, and you can't espouse belief in an allegiance to a god and be an atheist. Yet, for some bizarre reason, Socrates did not do this, despite the fact that he got his mission from the Dephelic oracle, which is traditionally associated with Apollo. He did not speak of Apollo. He simply spoke of the god. So I think it's safe to conclude that either Socrates was completely ignorant of his own culture's mythology, or his god was not one of the great gods. Since it seems so incredibly unlikely that somebody who we regard as so wise as Socrates would have been that profoundly ignorant of his own culture, and he indicated to Euphoro that he's aware of and rejects those mythological stories and traditions, it's then reasonable to conclude that whatever and whoever Socrates' god was, it wasn't one of the Greek gods, it was something else. So now this returns us to the apparent inconsistency or conflict between Socrates' reference to the gods, plural, and the god, as in Euphoro he says that it is the gods that are the ultimate foundation for the good, while in the Apology he indicates it is the god, singular, that grounds the good. Now, as I just finished talking about, Socrates was obviously well aware of the fact that the Greek gods were not very good at all, so then why did he refer to them this way in the text of Euphoro? Well, I think it's possible that perhaps Socrates' views on the gods changed over time. If Euphoro is a historical dialogue, it takes place just before Socrates enters his plea, and thus just right before the Apology. So it's possible that his realization that the gods must be good and that the Greek gods were not good is part of what moved him toward the belief in the god. That is, whoever his unnamed god was. However, if we take the text of Euphoro at face value, this discussion only occurred a couple of weeks before Socrates' trial, so that timeline doesn't work very well. He would have had to change his theology and philosophy and think all this through very, very quickly. And he says in the Apology that he had been about the gods' work for quite some time. So that leaves us with two possibilities here. The first is that it's possible Plato wrote that Socrates said, the gods are good, when in fact Socrates said, the god is good. As I talked about above, Plato used Socrates as his own mouthpiece for some of the dialogues. Now, the trouble with this explanation is that the Euphoro is usually regarded as one of the earlier dialogues, and hence, like the Apology, one of the more reliable and more accurate ones. It's also possible that Socrates' discussion with Euthyphro took place at a different time altogether, and Plato simply changed the setting and time for, say, dramatic reasons, but that explanation suffers from the same problem. The Euthyphro is generally thought to be pretty reliable. I think what's more likely is that, well, Euthyphro believes in the Greek gods, plural. Socrates does not, and Socrates is simply conversing with Euthyphro in a terminology that Euthyphro will accept. He's finding a good basis to talk to him from. He's, so to speak, meeting Euthyphro where he's at. As I talked about above, Socrates preferred leading people to knowledge rather than asserting or directly arguing for what he believed to be true. As Christian Wildberg explains, Socrates' philosophy engaged, quote, his interlocutors and to goad them on to the search for respectable answers in the depths of their own souls, answers which they could refine and successfully defend in back-and-forth dialectical conversations. So in plain English, that means Socrates would question people to help them get at the truth. That's what the Socratic method is. So rather than telling Euthyphro that he needs to abandon the gods, Socrates probably tried to guide him to see that any god worth being called God must be good by its own nature. And now quoting Paul Johnson again, he says, Socrates did not exactly abolish the fantastic polyism of ancient Greek paganism, with its human-like gods and goddesses and its godlike heroes apotheosized into deities, and all their fictionalized and poetic feuds, favoritism, magic, miracles, and interventions. This pantheon was fading fast even in his lifetime, and Socrates, always tender toward the superstitions of others, did not assault it frontally. So I think here Socrates probably hoped that in time, Euthyphro would also see that the Greek gods cannot be gods, as they are often evil. This seems to be in keeping with Socrates' style and methods as we see elsewhere, and again, as I've said before, he even tells Euthyphro as much that he rejects the mythology and traditions of the gods that shows them being evil, petty, and vindictive, and so on. So now, what are some things we can say about Socrates' god? Well, Socrates' god was unnamed. He did not name his god, but simply referred to it as the god, or God with a capital G. Now this is unusual for several reasons. First, the gods of the Greek pantheon were named and labeled. An unnamed god was a maybe not unheard of, but an unusual conception. Second, Socrates credits the god with speaking to him through his friend Chaerephon, I'm sure I'm mispronouncing that, at the oracle at Delphi. This oracle was associated with Apollo, so it's surprising that Socrates did not say that Apollo was his god. He could have easily indicated as much, but he chose not to. This is very similar to a person who claims to have received a divine message at a, say, Christian evangelical church, but then refuses to identify Christ or the triune God as the God from which he received it. It'd be comparable to if I told you that I went to First Baptist Church in my local town here and heard a message from God, and then you were like, oh, well, what did Christ say to you? And I said, no, not Christ, God. And I kept doing that over and over and over again. Eventually, at some point, you'd think, well, that's weird. Something's going on here. Now, given the pattern Socrates showed of being extremely cautious in declaring and labeling things, I think it's likely he did not name his god because he didn't know the god's name, and he did not want to guess wrong, and inadvertently dishonor or offend his god. He knew that it was not Apollo or another Greek god, so he refused to express allegiance to them, but he was unable to name his god, so he did not. He just simply referred to it as God or the unknown god. Now, we can also say that Socrates' god was personal. It wasn't some impersonal force like karma or something similar to that you get in Buddhism and other Eastern religions. It is impossible for an impersonal thing to give commands, make declarations, or have a will. Socrates thinks his god has done all these things, so his god must have been personal. Socrates' god was also limited by logic. Socrates said that his god could not lie or do evil, and he reasoned this was the case because the god's very nature was good, and it could not violate its own nature. Also, we can say that Socrates' god cared about people and took an interest in them. The god took an interest in Socrates' life and the lives of his fellow Athenians. It declared that there was no man wiser than Socrates, and by this sent Socrates on a mission to find wisdom. This in turn caused Socrates to attempt to guide his fellow Athenians toward the truth. It is fair to conclude that the god, if it existed and these stories are true, wanted to use Socrates to help his fellow men find and understand what is true. Now, as Socrates has been studied for over 2,000 years, it would be fair to argue that the god wanted to use Socrates not to guide just his fellow Athenians to the truth, but probably everyone, everywhere. So, wrapping this up a bit, There are some obvious difficulties in getting at what Socrates' theology was, what his beliefs about God were, just as there are with getting at any of Socrates' philosophy. He sits behind the writing of other men, and while Plato definitely thought and wrote very well of him, Plato had his own agendas, and it is usually thought that there is little certain about Socrates' life and thought. However, by drawing on only two of the earliest and most reliably historical Platonic dialogues, we still get a picture of Socrates with theological views that would have baffled and confused his fellow Athenians. While not explicitly denying the Greek pantheon, Socrates expressed allegiance to one single god that he did not or could not name. This unnamed god was personal, the good with a capital G, incapable of mistakes, limited by logic, and took an interest in Socrates and other people. It is so unlike any of the other Greek gods that his fellow Athenians worshipped as to raise the question, how did Socrates come to believe in such a god? Now, that's a question that I'm not really prepared to answer here. But we can say here that to argue that Socrates is an atheist, we also have to argue that he must have spent an awful lot of time just flat out lying about his atheism. As the great atheistic philosopher Bertrand Russell wrote about Socrates, the Apology gives a clear picture of a man very sure of himself, high-minded, indifferent to worldly success, believing that he is guided by a divine voice, and persuaded that clear thinking is the most important requisite for right living. Except in this last point, he resembles a Christian martyr or a Puritan. In the final passage where he considers what happens after death, it is impossible not to feel that he firmly believes in immortality. And so as you see here, even a committed atheist like Russell notes, it is difficult to read Socrates and doubt that he really believed in the God he claimed he was serving, and that he was truly committed to finding and knowing the truth. So it's been said that Socrates began his philosophy in wonder. Then somewhere along the way after this, he found a belief in one God, probably abandoned the Greek pantheon and attempted to guide his fellow Athenians toward the truth, and then he was tried and executed for it all. Now this all seems tragic, but there's really no room for tragedy in Socrates' view of the world, and if you read the Apology you'll see what I mean here. For him, it's far better to suffer than to do injustice, and there is no death that isn't evil because the real you is the soul inside of you, and so it doesn't matter what they do. Only you can hurt your own soul. And that gets into all kinds of very other good philosophical topics that maybe we'll talk about later, but there's something really noble about that idea that no one can ever do you evil that permanently harms you unless you let them. And that's part of the essence of Socrates' view, and go read the Apology to hear more about it. Socrates had a theology that was just radically out of sync with his culture. Socrates' God sounds a lot more like the God of a monotheistic religion than one from the Greek pantheon. This probably explains why, by Justin Martyr and Erasmus, he was regarded as a pre-Christian saint. So I think it's reasonable from this to say that if God actually does exist, then it's possible that he really did speak to Socrates, and Socrates was simply expressing an incomplete understanding of God. Now, as I said earlier, I kind of go back and forth whether God actually did speak to Socrates. I certainly do believe in God, but I don't think this should convince you if you don't believe in God. You're not going to find any of this persuasive unless you already do believe in God. But if you do believe in God, especially the Christian God, then I think you'll be able to see that there's some key patterns here that we see being repeated in Socrates' life and in what he said about his God that really do seem to fit very well with the triune God of Christianity. And so, yeah, I go back and forth, but most of the time I think, yeah, it seems very likely that that really was God doing something in pre-Christian Greece. And maybe I'm a little biased because I'm a philosopher, and that way I can then claim that God actually founded or gave us the discipline of philosophy. But still, it does kind of seem to fit to me. So now, even if you disagree, I still recommend you go read more stuff about Socrates. I quoted from a book by Paul Johnson that's just called Socrates. That's an excellent book to read if you want to learn more. I couldn't recommend it more highly. And you can find all of Plato's dialogues where he uses Socrates online. It's pretty easy to do, and they're very interesting and well written, well worth your time to read if you're not familiar with this stuff. Okay, so moving on. I wanted to talk about something good from this week and something bad from this week. I'd kind of gotten away from doing my little segments with all the interviews I've been doing the past couple weeks. Well, anyhow, back on Friday, I went and saw a movie called An Interview with God. I put up a thing on Facebook about that, And it was playing at actually the local Baptist church here has bought an old movie theater, and they now show movies in there occasionally, and then have people come back a couple days later to talk about those movies. And if you're ever trying to think of examples of things that churches could do to engage with culture better, I think this is one of them. I think they're on the right track for doing this. Anyhow, they were showing this movie, An Interview with God, which I was very pleasantly surprised by. It's typically movies that are blatantly and obviously Christian, as this one is if you watch it, are not very well made, not very interesting, and don't handle the subject matter very well. They're just not very well made movies usually. And this one has some flaws, but on the whole, it's very, very good. I'd say it's the best blatantly Christian movie that I've seen in a long time, probably 5 or 6 years. I think the last one I saw that was this good was one called The Way, where Martin Sheen plays a dentist on a pilgrimage in Europe. I forget the name of the pilgrim's route he's on there, but it's a pretty famous one. Anyhow, that's a great movie. You can look it up too. Well, the premise of this movie is that a journalist has come back from war in Afghanistan, and he has 3 interview sessions with someone who's claiming he's God, and the person playing God is the actor David Strathairn. I might be mispronouncing his last name, but you'll probably recognize him if you see movies. He was a villain in one of the Bourne movies. He's the admiral in the last Godzilla movie. He's been in quite a few different movies. He's a good actor. I think he's been nominated for an Academy Award once, too. And so the movie progresses, and this journalist it alternates between him going and interviewing this guy who says he's God and asking him questions about some of which are very philosophical and existential, some of which are a little bit more personal, and what's going on in the journalist's personal life. And now, the scenes in this movie where the journalist is talking with God, or maybe God, you have to watch the movie to know for sure, but those are brilliant. They're very, very well written, very well acted. The cinematography of them is very interesting. They vary the locations where they're talking and use them to kind of juxtapose what's going on in the conversation. Those are very, very clever, top-notch. That's the highlight of the movie. In fact, I would say cut out all the rest of the movie except for those conversations, and you've got a brilliant movie in and of itself right there. The only real criticism I had is the scenes and parts of the film that aren't the two of them talking. There you can really kind of see the cracks. They're not as well made. They're not as well done. The cinematography isn't as well done. The acting is a lot more wooden. And so you kind of find yourself getting a little more pulled out of the movie there, only to have him go back to interview the God character again, and you're pulled right back into the drama of it. Now, my wife often tells me that I'm way too critical of movies, and I guess it's just because I like seeing really, really good ones. I took a course on film theory and criticism a long time ago, and I've never been able to look at movies the same since then, because I tend to turn a much more critical eye to some of those technical aspects and things like that. But nonetheless, I would say that in this movie, the scenes between the two leads are just so well written, so interesting. It's so great to see this dialogue between God and this journalist going back and forth, that more than makes up for the flaws in the other scenes in the film. In fact, this dialogue is very reminiscent of how you read Job and God talking in Book of Job. The only difference is that God doesn't come down on this journalist near as hard as he comes down on Job. And to this movie's credit, it doesn't try to give you some just really easy, simple answers to all these difficult, hard questions of philosophy and life. The only time I think it maybe does that a little bit is the journalist asks God about the problem of divine foreknowledge, which is, how can I be free if you, God, know what I'm going to do? And God more or less says, well, I sit outside of time. Time works differently than me. And that's probably the only time I can think of where they maybe gave a just hand-wave explanation. But even that's not really a hand-wave explanation, because that's a serious philosophical position that's argued for by many serious philosophers and theologians in response to that problem. It's not just that doesn't matter. There's some people who've argued for that position in great detail. So anyhow, if you get the chance to see this movie, go do it. It's well worth your time to see this movie. As I said, the scenes where the two of them are engaging are absolutely phenomenal. The other parts not so much, but that's okay. The phenomenal scenes of the God character and the journalist engaging are more than worth it. And I think the question that this movie prompts is, if you had a chance to sit across from God and he was going to talk to you face to face, what question would you ask him? And when I first heard about this movie, I thought about that a little bit. And, being a philosopher, my first thought runs to, well, which philosopher got more things right? Was it Aristotle or Plato, or should we go with Kant? Or what about this historical event? Or, other questions like that. But then as I thought about it a little more, I realized, no, that's not really the question I should be asking. And it shouldn't even be probably shouldn't even be a question like, why does bad things happen to good people? Why is there the problem of evil? Those are the questions that Job posed, and God pretty much refused to answer them and more or less said to Job, who are you to ask me these questions? So, after thinking about it for a while, what I've thought is that if I had the chance to sit across from God and ask him a question, I'd probably have a list of about 5 or 10 if I knew I had the time in advance. But anyhow, the first question I think I should ask him is, what question should I ask you? And I don't say that to try to be clever, but just to say that if it's really God, he's so much more wise and knowledgeable than me that I'm not even going to be in a position to know enough to ask him the right and best questions. I have to actually get him to tell me what I need to ask him. That's kind of just what it means for him to be God. So think about that. Think about what questions you would want to ask God, and if you get the chance to go see this movie, do it. It's pretty good. I wouldn't say it's a 10. Maybe give it like a, 8, mid-8 or something like that. It could have been a 10 if the other scenes were as good as the ones where the God character and the journalists were engaging. So now, on to something bad for this week. The bad thing for this week is that the politicians are lying to you as they usually do, but not in the same way that you'd think. I've noticed a certain trend here, and I want to call it out. I'm not sure if this falls under a specific logical fallacy. Maybe you could say it's a false dilemma, but I've noticed that both of the sides are engaging in something where one side will lie about a problem by exaggerating it, and the other side will lie about the problem by claiming it does not exist. And the current government shutdown is a wonderful example of this. Because you have President Trump, who's severely exaggerating the problems that are at the U.S.-Mexican border and arguing that he needs to build a wall, which, forget about the wall, that's neither here nor there. The point is, he's severely exaggerating the problems, both in his rhetoric and the actual things he talks about. Remember, for example, when he said on the campaign trail something like, oh, they're bringing guns, drugs, and so on and so forth, and then almost as an afterthought he said something like, and some of them I've been told are nice people, or something like that. Then on the other side, you have the Democrats like Speaker Pelosi and Leader Schumer, who are claiming, well, there is no problem at all. There's no problem at the border at all. And a rational person should be able to look at that and say, well, you're both wrong. President Trump, there are problems at the border, but they're not existential crises that are going to kill us all. If the U.S. border was completely opened up today, it would affect people at the border pretty severely, quite quickly, but for most of the rest of us, we wouldn't be directly affected by it for a while. We would begin to be getting indirectly affected, but it's not like people with a bunch of AK-47s are going to pour through and start mowing us all down or something horrific like that. And conversely, when the Democrats will say things like, oh, there's no problems and it's racist that he wants to put it up there, that's obviously ridiculous too, because there are problems there. Border Patrol has to dispense crowds who are charging the border with tear gas. There's a lot of drug traffic that pours through there. There's an immense amount of drug cartel violence on the Mexican side of the border. There are problems there, but they're not existential nightmare scenario problems either. And so that's a situation you have going on in politics today where one side lies by exaggerating it and saying, we're all going to die. And the other side lies by saying, there's no problem, you're crazy for saying we're all going to die. And it is crazy to say we're all going to die, but there are problems that need to be dealt with. And so then, as a reasonable, rational person, you're kind of left in the middle saying, well, they're all wrong, so what am I supposed to do? And another example of that where the roles are kind of twisted would be climate change. When now Speaker Pelosi gave her little, I don't know what you'd call it, like acceptance speech or whatever when she became Speaker again, she talked about how climate change is an existential threat to our existence. And again, she's at best grossly exaggerating there, while often people who politically oppose her will deny that there's climate change happening at all. Now, it's stupid to deny there's climate change. Climate is constantly changing. The weather is different today than it was yesterday. That's climate change in a small sense. And you can measure the fact that the temperature changes grossly over time. That's why there was an ice age a long time ago and there's not now. And there's some evidence that it was significantly warmer during some periods of, I think it was the Egyptian and the Roman empires as well. That's one of the Some people think that's one of the reasons why they had successful empires, is the growing season was longer, so they had more food and more people. But it doesn't necessarily follow from the fact that climate actually is changing, to some degree at least, that the seas are all going to rise 100 feet and we're all going to die. In fact, when you actually start asking the relevant experts on the matter, people who are climate scientists and things along those lines about it, you find that 99, I think, they say it's 99% of scientists agree. Well, that's a bit misleading. It's 99% of scientists agree that the climate is changing. Then when you go on and ask further questions like, well, is the primary cause of it man-made activity like pollution and things like that? That number goes down. Then when you ask, is there anything we can do about it? Again, that number goes down. The consensus is much smaller. Ask, is it a bad thing or a good thing? The number goes down. There's overwhelming consensus that the climate is changing. How, why, and if it's a good or a bad thing, nowhere near that level of consensus, because those are much more difficult questions to answer. It's very easy to just make some scientific observations and prove, oh, the temperature is getting a little warmer here and a little cooler there. Not at all so easy to say, it's a good thing, it's a bad thing, and here's why. So the problem here is that Speaker Pelosi and other Democrats tend to blow this way out of proportion and say, the temperature is going up, therefore we're all going to die, which is not at all the case. It doesn't follow at all. And conversely, a lot of people on the political right, the Republicans and so on, just didn't turn around and deny it's happening at all, which is obviously equally ridiculous. Of course the climate is getting warmer, but we need to then go through and do the hard questions of trying to figure out, is it a problem? Is it something is there anything we can do about it? Are we the primary problems? Would it even make a difference if we in the U.S. did things, given how big the pollution is coming out of, say, China and India, that we really can't do anything about, and so on and so forth? And the reason why you see these kind of things happening, I think, why it is that Trump will blow immigration way out of proportion and the Democrats will say there's no problem, and why you see the opposite thing with climate change, is because it's a whole lot easier to just make it into a big problem and get people riled up to vote for you than it is to actually do the hard work of trying to engage with the issue and work through it. There's a whole lot of very difficult questions that we need to be asked and answered before we can know how to deal with climate change, if we should deal with it, or what's going on about it. And likewise with immigration, the problem isn't that there's no wall on the U.S.-Mexican border. The problem is a combination of many things. There's economic forces that encourage cheap labor to come from Mexico and other Central American countries into the United States. There's a drug trade because here in the U.S., unfortunately, we have a very, very high appetite for illicit drugs. I wish it wasn't so, but it is. And there's a number of other social factors that play into that as well. The government in Mexico is horrifically corrupt, so people naturally want to leave if they can, because who wants to live under a horrifically corrupt government? And all those things come into play, and it creates pressure on the people in Mexico and Central America, to immigrate to the U.S., legally or not. And so these problems are difficult. How would you begin to address them? If you change economics so that people don't want to immigrate to the U.S., that probably means you've turned the U.S. into a horrible place. How are you going to turn around and make a government that's in Mexico not corrupt, other than going in, like overthrowing it, installing your own one, and so on and so forth? The problems that are actually driving what's going on at the U.S.-Mexican border are difficult, complex, and numerous. And it's going to be difficult and take a lot of work to deal with them. But it's a whole lot easier just to cry, they're bringing drugs and guns, and, well, let's build a wall. Now, maybe the wall will help a little bit, like, treating the symptom of a disease, but you're not actually treating the disease, which is all these combinations of factors. And it's, again, pretty similar with climate change. It's a whole lot easier to just get people riled up by saying, we're going to die because the temperature is going up, than it is to say, well, we need to figure this out. We need to figure, is it this combination of greenhouse gases that do this? What's the point of no return? Are we there yet? If we scale back, is it going to matter because China and India won't, and so on and so forth. It's just a whole lot easier to say it's an existential threat and it's causing all of our problems. So as you're watching the politicians talk about things, be it the government shutdown and immigration, climate change, or whatever, just watch for that. It's very likely the case that one side is going to hyper-exaggerate a legitimate problem, blow it way out of proportion, and scream, we're all going to die. And the other side is going to pretend the problem doesn't even exist, because that's what they're stuck in doing right now. And I would say, if you get the chance, call them out on it. You know, if you're at a political rally or you get a chance to speak with one of your representatives or senators or something, and they're Republicans, ask them, why are you denying that climate change is real? And then go on and actually try to ask the follow-up questions like, what can we do about it? Is it actually a problem? And so on and so forth. Don't just be one of those people who shout stupid slogans. And say, if they're Democrats, call them out on the fact that they're denying that there are actual problems at the border, because there are. And again, they're not existential problems that are going to kill us all, but they are problems. It's stuff like this that brings to mind that wonderfully tragic and hilarious quote from Churchill that says that democracy is the worst form of government except all the other ones that we've ever tried, because it sure seems that way. So now, tell me what you think. Give me some feedback on this episode. Do you think the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob really did speak to Socrates, or was something else going on? Did no God speak to him and he was crazy? Or, what do you think? Read the apology and let me know. Also, what questions would you ask God if you were sitting across from him? Write in and let me know. And write in, let me know what you think about the false dilemma fallacy that I've observed our politicians doing. Give me some feedback. And as always, I'm certainly open to any other topics you'd like to hear me explore, whether it's philosophical, political, or whatever. Write in and let me know, and if it's possible, I'll try and do an episode about it. As always, you can reach me at theexaminedlifewithphil@gmail.com, and I've started a Facebook group called The Examined Life with Phil, and you can reach me there. So thanks again for listening, and I'll talk to you all again next week.
We hope you enjoyed the program and will join us back for another show on WCAT.